Hello and welcome. Are American troops around the world keeping the peace or simply extending the American empire? The long-term involvement of the US military in a number of overseas campaigns has raised the question of what America's deeper goals really are. Hundreds of thousands of US troops are fighting two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and a third undeclared war along Pakistan's border. Thousands more are manning US Army bases in Middle Eastern nations, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Qatar. And American soldiers have also been stationed for decades in Japan, Germany, South Korea, and dozens of other countries. And critics say that the US military's global reach is motivated by Washington's hubris and imperialistic ambitions. But supporters argue that American interventionism is necessary, even critical, to promote peace and protect democracy around the world. So today we ask, is the world's only superpower using its military muscle to impose its will or to advance the cause of democracy and human rights? Tell us what you think by calling in with your questions and comments. You can also send us an SMS or an email. Joining me now from New York is retired US Army officer Andrew Bacevich, who believes that American foreign policy has hurt rather than helped US interests. He explains why in his book, Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War. And with me in the studio is Blake Hounshell, the managing editor of the US-based magazine Foreign Policy. He says that in some cases, there have been benefits from US military interventions. I welcome you both. And Professor Bacevich, if I could start with you there, sir. Give me the clearest examples you can of how you think US foreign policy has essentially hurt rather than helped America.
Well, I think that ever since President Jimmy Carter in 1979 articulated the Carter Doctrine, the U.S. has step by step been attempting to dominate the greater Middle East, relying chiefly on military power to do so. And I think if we look back at the 30 years since that time, I think most people, just looking at the facts, would conclude that the region has become not more stable, but less stable. And certainly one explanation for that instability has been U.S. military presence and activities in the region.
Professor, do you feel that there is a clear underlying agenda that is being carried forward? Well, you gave the example of President Carter, but say from President Carter's period on, do you feel that every president has followed a basic code of how the U.S. should intervene in its foreign policy?
I don't think that there's some kind of a master plan that's stuck away in a safe somewhere that only one president passes on to the others. But I do think that there is a strong tendency, there is a continuing conviction that the United States has the capacity to bring order, to impose an order on the greater Middle East, and successive administrations attempt to pursue that objective in different ways. For George W. Bush, the emphasis was on Iraq. He believed that the so-called liberation of Iraq would trigger some vast transformation of the Islamic world. For President Obama, the emphasis is on Afghanistan. He believes that the war in Afghanistan is going to contribute to the stability of Central Asia and to help alleviate the problems threatening Pakistan.
Well, Blake Hounshell, I want to welcome you in as well, and thank you for being with us too. Where do you see prime examples of where American foreign policy has essentially, certainly in the post-World War II era, benefited the world?
Well, listen, it's certainly not the case that the U.S. is just imposing its will on vast swaths of the world. Most of the places where the U.S. has military bases, we've been invited there. And a place like Qatar, a place like Bahrain, where the U.S. has military bases, they've invited U.S. forces there because they fear their neighbors. And so in a lot of places, the U.S. is a force for stability, and the U.S. is welcomed with open arms. That doesn't mean that the U.S. is, doing great things in a place like Iraq. Certainly, it's hard to argue that. But it's just not the case that there's some vast American empire out there imposing its will on the world.
Now, there's this question about America being the world police, so to speak. And I wonder, there's a question, if I might put to you, that we got from a viewer from our Facebook page, from Mafashkan Efek, who says, wherever the US intervenes, there is more disorder than peace. America is gradually losing its credibility with other nations. To what degree do you feel that there is a sense of America's lost its focus?
Well, I think, there's certainly the looming question of Iraq and Afghanistan that overshadows a lot of the good things that the United States has done around the world. in a place like Kosovo, which just recently was declared that it could become an independent country by the International Court of Justice. So there are places around the world where U.S. intervention has proved positive. Now, for every example like that, there's a place like Somalia where U.S. interventionism has gone awry.
Of course, with Kosovo, it was a long, bloody path to that stage, and people wondered about the speed of intervention by the international community in general on that. We'll get on to that and other issues in just a moment. Let me get a caller in, though. We've got Pakistan on the line. Amin, thanks for joining us. What would you like to ask?
My question basically evolves around the media, because I mean any war, I mean if one takes a look at it, somehow or the other is fueled by the media somehow or the other, whether the ideology or the thought of it is correct. If we look at media from this perspective, and we take a look at the Vietnam War, we had movies like Full Metal Jacket, we had movies like Platoon that came out that promoted an ideology. Being a Muslim and coming from a Muslim country, if we take one look at, for example, you might say the Israel situation about the Jewish, movement, etc., against the Muslims and all, then then they say that in 1942 what happened was genocide.
Okay.
So.
Let me get to Professor Bacevich and ask this. One thing, the suggestion that our viewer is putting forward, Professor, is that the media to some degree is responsible for creating the portrayal of certain stereotypes. Now, I wonder to what degree you feel it's not necessarily foreign policy, but perhaps the media's interpretation of some of what's happening around the world that triggers this sense of dishonor for the U.S. in some people's eyes.
Well, I would be very cautious about assigning too much responsibility to the media or to the images that the media projects of any place or of any particular event. Ultimately, policy is made by senior officials in the United States and in other countries. That said, I think that, and this is one of the points I try to make in my book, Washington sees the world in a particular way, and Washington defines America's proper role in the world in a particular way, because there is a consensus to which both civilian officials, senior military officers, senior corporate executives, and people in the media all subscribe. And let me give you an example of what I mean. And this, I think, gets to really the topic of the program. That Washington consensus believes that a global U.S. military presence contributes to peace and stability. And people in Washington are deeply committed to this proposition, to the point where they refuse to face up to the abundant evidence suggesting just the contrary.
Okay, let's get a caller in from Virginia here in the USA, and Oliver's on the line. Go ahead, Oliver.
Thanks, Riz. First of all, I like just to say that the U.S. military has preserved the peace in Western Europe for almost 70 years against the Soviet threat, and also preserved the peace in South Korea against the North Koreans. And also in the Gulf states, my question comes here. If the U.S. military is not in the Gulf states, who's going to protect the Gulf states if the U.S. military withdrew from the Gulf states? And we see a couple months ago the performance of the Saudi military when they fought against the Houthis. So these countries, they cannot defend themselves against any adversary, especially Iran.
Oliver, thank you very much. Blake, if I could put this to you, and what Oliver said just there, and add also an email we had, a question we had, or comment by Twitter from Steve Harland, says, an impartial country should police the world. However, the US is far from impartial. Doesn't the UN serve this purpose? Now, what I want to get at is, if the US has served this purpose of keeping the peace in Europe, in certain areas in the Middle East for so long, is it time now for a more neutral world body such as the UN, which is the main one, of course, to be able to take its place and do that?
Well, I think it's a bit of a myth to think that the UN is a neutral world body. Remember, the main decisions that the UN makes are controlled by the Security Council, of which the US is one member, but you also have Russia and China, who don't necessarily share US values or interests. I don't think that most of the world would want to be governed under China's rules or Russia's rules. So I think, the reason that U.S. power has been so long-lived is that up until the last decade or so, that legitimacy has been basically unquestioned. And now we're seeing a lot of people say maybe the United States doesn't have the right to police the world anymore, and that's dangerous.
At least with the UN, you have the aspects of vetoes and debate, and even if these countries have differing interests, it's a world body as opposed to a single country with its own interests.
But I think we've seen with the UN that it most often leads to paralysis rather than prompt action. When you have places like the Balkans, where the UN was there on the ground and failed to intervene promptly because the countries that made up the UN Security Council hadn't empowered the peacekeeping troops there to keep the peace.
Well, let's get before we take a break, let's get Jasmine in DC to give us her question or comment. Go ahead.
Hello?
Hi, go on.
Hi. Yeah, if the U.S., this is a question first to the Colonel. So if the U.S. really withdraws from Iraq next year, does he think that the Iraqi military is really ready to lead Iraq without the presence of U.S. troops there?
Okay, Jasmine, I'm going to get to that question straight after a break. We've got to take a very short break here. When we return, what is the best way for the United States to engage in a multilateral way with the rest of the world? We'll be right back. Welcome back. Does the US have the moral authority to police the world? Critics say the American empire imposes its own form of global order on unwilling nations, but supporters argue that the only superpower on earth has the right to lead the world and keep the peace. Now, discussing those issues with me are Professor Andrew Bacevich, who teaches international relations and history at Boston University and is critical of the US military interventions. He's in New York, and here in the studio is the managing editor of Foreign Policy magazine, Blake Hounshaw, who believes that in some cases US military actions have a positive impact, such as in the creation of an independent Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, our viewer before the break, Jasmine, was talking about the issue of Iraq and US troops. A short while ago, US President Barack Obama addressed the Disabled American Veterans Organization in Atlanta. Here's part of what he had to say.
As agreed to with the Iraqi government, we will maintain a transitional force until we remove all our troops from Iraq by the end of next year. And during this period, our forces will have a focused mission, supporting and training Iraqi forces, partnering with Iraqis in counterterrorism missions, and protecting our civilian and military efforts.
Professor Bacevich, listening to what President Obama had to say and the question that Jasmine from DC had asked earlier on, do you really expect any kind of real withdrawal of American troops as planned, or is it going to be a redefining? This transitional period, of course, is the transitional troops, of course, is perhaps a redefinition, and that the American presence is just going to be lingering there.
Oh, no, I expect that there will be a very substantial drawdown of the U.S. military presence. I mean, the truth is that Americans generally want to have done with Iraq. The majority of Americans recognize that the Iraq war was misguided from the outset and mismanaged throughout. There are a handful of Americans who want to pretend that this is ending as a success. But that's frankly absurd. But we want to get out. We can't afford to stay there. You know, Blake made the point earlier, as did a caller, that there have been times when the United States has contributed stability. Post-World War Europe is a good example. But Europe can manage its own affairs today. And there's one huge difference between, let's say, the late 1940s and the present moment. And that huge difference is the United States can no longer afford to be the world's policeman. We have tremendous economic problems that we face at home, and we can ill afford to ignore them.
Well, our viewers are very keen to get involved in this debate, and we have a call from Dubai now. Malik, your question or comment, please.
My comment is, U.S. has gone and bombed so many countries during the last 20 years, I know. And a lot of innocent people have died. They don't even know why they are dying for, first of all. You see, the point here, my question is, what is the point you bombing so many countries? Your economy is in shatters. And when your economy goes down, it affects the whole world. Haven't the guys realized it at least now? This is my question.
Okay. Malik, thank you very much. Blake, I want to put this to you, actually, because one of the things that happened after the pogroms of Adolf Hitler and the Holocaust was that, this would never be allowed to happen again. And yet we saw Rwanda, we saw what happened in Bosnia, or the former Yugoslavia in general. We saw what happened was still happening in Congo to a large degree. And the scale of deaths is millions. It's not even tens of thousands, it's millions. So people then lose confidence and say, well, where is America? Where is the world superpower in stopping this happening now?
Right. I mean, there's this paradox out there. People are afraid of American power. People don't like it when innocent civilians get killed, including Americans. But on the other hand, whenever there's a conflict anywhere in the world, the United States is expected to be the cavalry that rides in and saves the day. And as Dr. Basevich pointed out, we can't afford to do that. So the United States picks and chooses where it decides to intervene, and sometimes it makes us look hypocritical. What
do you think, Blake, on the issue of, for example, the drone attacks that have been taking part on the border of Pakistan, in terms of what it does for U.S. credibility? You have unmanned craft, and there's been a lot of civilian casualties as a result.
Well, I was most interested in this latest Pew poll that came out about opinions in Pakistan, and I think what the poll said was that about half of Pakistanis don't even know that the drone attacks are going on. But those that are aware of them, 90% of them oppose them. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the Pakistani government hasn't owned up and said, you know what, we're collaborating with the Americans and we're going after bad guys. They've denounced the attacks while they're actually complicit in them. So I think that there's a real problem when you have your own partner isn't willing to admit what it's doing.
Basically.
Exactly.
Well, Dr. Basevich, perhaps if I could get you to answer an email question we had from Stu in Australia. An interesting idea here. He says, well, if the US is going to police the world, shouldn't global citizens be allowed to vote in American elections? US actions affect everybody, yet only American citizens have a say.
Well, again, I mean, you're asking somebody who believes that the United States doesn't have the capacity to police the world. And quite frankly, when I speak to people who come from other countries, I urge them to come to terms with that fact. We had a caller earlier who said, if the U.S. pulls out of the Gulf, who's going to defend the Gulf states? Well, I'm sorry. Those nations are going to have to look after their own affairs. And frankly, they can probably do that much more effectively than can the United States. But nope, our Constitution is a very fine document, and the Constitution says that only Americans will vote in American elections.
Now we've got a caller from Iraq now. Yusuf, what would you like to add to the debate?
Hi, Mr. Riz, and
hi.
Also I want to say hi for the gentleman in the studio.
Thank you.
And actually, I am one of the Iraqi veterans, and today I have to speak of the Mr. President Obama about the veterans. And I hope that someone will take care about our case, because there is a lot of money has been accumulated in the United Nations compensation box. And I hope that someone will offer us.
Okay, so I didn't hear that very clearly, Yusuf, but I think basically you were talking about the consequences of what's happened in Iraq and some sort of compensation, or at least some kind of redress of the situation in Iraq right now. And Dr. Basevich, perhaps I could put that to you, that when the US does go in a place like Iraq, there's a lot of questions whether or not that was a legal war in the first place, and America obviously got itself tangled into Iraq. What is left for the citizens of Iraq once the US does pull out? What sort of, I guess, guarantee should they have that what has happened will leave them in a better state, as was promised initially?
Well, there are no guarantees. We need to disabuse ourselves of these false expectations that American policy is driven by moral considerations. It's certainly true that American politicians use the language of morality to justify American actions, but there has never been a great power in history that has tapped moral values as the principal source of its behavior, and that statement applies to the United States as much as it applies to Great Britain or France or any other great power.
Blake, to what degree is there the risk that, as some people say, of the American empire, as some people see it, overstretching itself? They say when empires reach out too far and spread themselves too thin, they collapse.
Well, arguably we have overstretched ourselves in Iraq and Afghanistan this last decade, and I think there are a lot of people, even among Republicans on the right in the United States that are questioning whether we're spending too much money on the military. But I think, Dr. Bacevich is actually right that there's probably not going to be a fundamental reassessment of, do we need to have 700 bases around the world? Do we need to have 600? I think on balance, the United States has been a force for good, but it's time to start questioning whether we've gone too far.
Professor, let me get a quote from your book, Washington Rules, here, and read this to you very quickly. We don't have much time, but it says, the United States has drawn down the stores of authority and goodwill that it had acquired by 1945. Words uttered in Washington command less respect than once was the case. Americans can ill afford to indulge any longer in dreams of saving the world, much less remaking it in our own image. The curtain is now falling on the American century. This follows on from what I was asking Blake about, the sort of collapse of the American empire. But let me ask you, to what degree this view of a global order is driven by America's military-industrial complex as opposed to just the politicians?
Oh, it's a very important component. When Blake just made reference to a growing realization that we cannot afford to be spending as much on our military as the whole rest of the world combined, which is the case, there are a considerable number of institutions that are committed to the United States continuing to be the world's only superpower. Okay. Corporations make money. Bureaucracies justify their budgets and prerogatives.
Well, Professor?
Generals chase their ambitions. There's plenty of opposition.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. There's a fascinating debate. I hope we get a chance to revisit it. Thank you very much, Dr. Bacevich. Thank you very much as well, Blake Hanshaw, for joining us. Thank you for sending in your questions and calling in as well. A lot of interest there. Now, remember, you can download a free podcast of the show on iTunes. This week, we're featuring a discussion on state-controlled capitalism and its complicated relationship with free market economies. On the next show, crackdown on crime. France claims its illegal Roma communities are a serious threat to social order. Will President Sarkozy's plan to deport the Roma actually serve the public interest, or is it an attempt to shift the focus off the country's political and economic challenges? Tune in from that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.